Excellent. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Kevin Haggerty. I'm professor of sociology and criminology at the University of Alberta. Normally, Dr. Sandra Bucerius, who is the director of the Center for Criminological Research, would be leading this, but Sandra is indisposed today, and I can guarantee you she would rather be here than doing what she's doing. But I'm glad you could join us. Before we get underway, I do want to start us off in a good way by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is primarily located on the territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Stoney, Dene, Iroquois, and Anishinaabe lands that are now known as parts of Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and the homeland of the Métis. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations. So thanks for joining us. Before I turn it over to Dr. Lindsay Bing, who will introduce our speaker today, I just want to for those of you who might not have participated before, we have about an hour together, and people are joined on Zoom, and there is also a YouTube channel that some people join. And at the end, if you're on Zoom, you can ask questions just by raising your hand. You can put comments in the comment section. If you're on the YouTube channel, you can pass messages on to, I think Reg is going to be kind of passing those along. And I think that's enough for us. I should also say that given that we live in this new Goffman-esque virtual kind of interpersonal kind of situation, I realize there's reasons people might have to not turn on their cameras, but just as a courtesy, if possible, it'd be great to turn on your camera, just because speaking for myself, just lecturing into the void is a little alienating. So with that out of the way, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bing.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Brielle Bryan is an assistant professor at Rice University, and she's a member of the Osage Nation. Dr. Bryan's work focuses on inequality, stratification, and mobility in the United States, with a special emphasis on racial inequality in the criminal legal system. Her work spans the subfields of criminology, demography, and economic sociology, and highlights the stark and racially unequal financial, civic, and social consequences of felony conviction and imprisonment. Dr. Bryan's recent publications shed new light on the financial ramifications of such contact, specifically that borne by the mothers of incarcerated adults, and then through the economic exclusion of people after they leave prison and their access to banking and housing. Today, Dr. Bryan's sharing her experimental audit study, which I think is the first, or at least the best, to address this issue of examining the effects of felony conviction records on housing. So I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Bryan.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm thrilled to get to present today. And I will note this is, well, as you will soon hear, a very large data collection that has thankfully completed, but the analysis is still very much happening. And so I look forward to any suggestions and ideas, questions that can push forward the analysis in more helpful and interesting ways. So let me share, hopefully, the right thing. All right, I'm going to share a desktop and ask you all if it is a very strange shape. I have like a turned screen. Is everybody getting a super long vertical thing? Okay, let me see if I can share this a different way. How about that? Does that look more traditional? No, not at all. All right, I'm going to have to give...
It is easy to see, though.
Yeah.
Is it? Okay. What is my best option here? Let me try one last thing to see if I can get it in a standard sort of way where I can still also look at you all. And otherwise, we're going to have to abandon this. Or I wish there was like system hold music. Oh, thank you. Perfect. Okay. Understand. Here. Oh, where have we gone? All right, I'm gonna call it and give up. And unfortunately, it will be in sort of a strange shape, but you will at least be able to see it. So let's try that. All right, so it is at least visible, even if in an odd shape.
It's
Okay.
optimized for mobile viewing.
Ah, perfect. There you go. Let me tell the janitorial staff not to walk into my office right now. Okay, not now. So later. Thanks. Okay. All right, a series of interruptions, but I will say once again, finally, thank you so much for having me today. And let me just jump right into what this is. So Dr. Bang Lindsay gave a great introduction talking about sort of the overall goals of what I will be presenting today, but I'll start off with my research questions. Noting first off that this is a study that has a series of sort of multi-level research questions, but the primary overarching question is just a simple one of how much discrimination do people with felony convictions face in the private rental market? And so this first primary research question is motivated in large part by the fact that about 1 in 12 Americans or 19 million adults are estimated to have a felony conviction record, which far surpasses the share of Americans who have an imprisonment record, but who have been more often the focus of research for a number of reasons we could talk about later and that most of you are probably well aware of. And this number of Americans, the share of Americans eclipses even the share of Americans who are veterans. So it's a sizable share of the US adult population. The other motivation for this research project and this particular research question is the fact that rental discrimination on the basis of criminal history is permissible and legal in almost everywhere in the United States. So as a result of that, criminal background checks are a routine part of tenant screening for most landlords. And it also means that you, not always, but with some regularity, if you're looking through rental housing ads in the United States, you may see some sort of phrase like this in an ad indicating that people with convictions are summarily excluded from being considered to rent a unit. There are a number of cities, however, that have started to pass things called fair chance housing ordinances. So these are laws that prohibit landlords' use of criminal background checks or actually running the screens or even asking anything directly of tenants. Exactly how these policies work varies. In a couple of places, landlords are just wholly banned from using any information on criminal background history when screening tenants. In other places, it's not quite as stark. It's some sort of limit on when in the process landlords can review this information. The largest city and the most recent city to have adopted one of these ordinances is New York City. This passed just over a year ago and is going into effect, or just has gone into effect as of January of this year. So what this means for people is yet to be seen. But as anyone who is familiar with the ban the box legislation knows, there's research in this area thinking about or looking at how these sorts of similar ban the box laws that prohibit employers from asking about criminal history or limiting the extent to which they consider it. These studies have looked into what the adoption of ban the box policies have meant for racial inequality in the labor market. And unfortunately, there are several studies that suggest that such policies end up inadvertently disadvantaging lower educated Black and brown men who are, in the absence of being able to ask about criminal history, are experience statistical discrimination and are less likely to get callbacks, presumably because of an assumption that if an employer can't ask them about criminal history or check, they may be more likely to have a criminal history than a different applicant. So all of this helps lead to the next set of questions that I'm tacking onto this overarching research question. So I don't want to just look at, in general, what is the overall rate of response for people with and without felony convictions if we're thinking about the rental housing market. I'm very much interested in also thinking about how individual level characteristics can moderate this relationship. So in particular, race and gender are of primary interest in thinking about potentially moderating what you might call a felony effect in terms of rental housing discrimination, but I'm also looking at a number of other things like parent status, marital status, age, age of conviction, and I think that's all of them. I'll show all of them to you in a moment. And the next thing I want to note is, in addition to thinking about these individual level characteristics, I'm also very much interested in thinking about how we might see variation across place, both at a small scale, thinking about different types of neighborhoods and how neighborhood characteristics might moderate the extent of discrimination that landlords are exhibiting, but also how at a city level or even state level scale, we might see variation based on different characteristics. I do want to go back to something Lindsay said at the very beginning. I do want to acknowledge this is not the first ever study to look at housing market discrimination against people with some sort of criminal background, be it felony conviction or just sort of criminal record has been used as the test characteristic before. But this is the largest one. And because of that, I'm able to look at a lot more things than other researchers have been able to do. There have been a number of small individual city level studies that have looked at some characteristics, but generally they've not had the statistical power necessary to look at these overlapping questions of how individual level characteristics may moderate these effects and how the size of disparities may vary across place. So a last thing I will note as justification for why I also want to think about variation, not just by individual level characteristics, but across place, is that we know in the US, at least, there is a lot of variance in the share of the adult population that has had criminal justice system contact. So these are best available estimates looking at 2010, the estimated share of the adult population in various US states that had a felony conviction. And on the left side, we see that for all adults, regardless of race. And on the right-hand side, we see it for Black adults. And so there is obviously a different context in different states. So what it means to indicate that you have a felony conviction when looking for housing is going to mean something slightly different in these different places, depending on how common an experience that is and how many people in the rental market might bear that sort of stigma. Okay, so the first thing I want to note is that answering all of these questions at once requires a lot of statistical power. So I'm going to talk about how I've gone through building this study in an attempt to actually achieve the statistical power necessary to do all these things at once. So the first broadest thing to note is that I am using a correspondence test approach. So this is the same sort of idea as an audit study. It's just that it's all online. I'm not sending out any testers in person. I am sending emails to units that have been posted in different cities. And I'm indicating within the text of the email and the signature that I attached to the email, as well as the email address itself, the different test conditions, which I'll note in a moment. The other thing I will note is that my sampling frame, if you will, the site that I'm using is Craigslist, which is, for anybody who's not familiar, it is a large online marketplace that is for the most part free to use, and that has localized websites across different American countries and also across different American cities and across different cities around the world as well. But the great thing about it is these websites, although they are market specific, they function in the same way. and they have a standard way of listing rental housing ads. So this is an example ad, and as you can see here, it includes some pictures. The vast majority of Craigslist ads also have a map like this with a pin showing roughly where the unit is located. And if you see here, sometimes you're even lucky enough to get a specific address. In fact, in a surprising share, you get the specific street address, and in the vast majority of them, if the specific street address is not provided, cross streets are provided. So I'm able to get pretty granular geographic information on where these units are. The next thing I will note is that for anybody who is searching for housing on Craigslist, there is this button at the top of the screen that says reply. And if you click it, sometimes you will get a phone number, but every time you will get an email address. And so you can send an email to that email address asking for more information. There is no standardized form. It just pops up in your whatever your email application is with an email address to send to, and you get to choose what to write. And so that is the approach we've used, is that we're sending emails where we get to fully decide the text. We're not doing any sort of form as you might do on Zillow or other websites, and trying to indicate test conditions. We're designing the text ourselves. So as for those test conditions in the email, the first primary one is felony conviction history, as you may have gathered from my research questions. But amongst those where I indicate a felony conviction, I've split it across different ages of felony conviction. So in the emails, if I mention a felony conviction, I will say I have a felony conviction that's 2 years old, 5 years old, 8 years old, or 12 years old. And then in addition to that, for everyone, regardless of whether or not they get a felony, or for everyone, these are all hypothetical people. So I should say for every email, regardless of whether a felony conviction is indicated, I also randomly vary, but with equal probability, race, ethnicity, gender, marital status, parent status, just meaning I indicate a child being present in the household or not, and then age of the individual. So I should also note, I am happy to take interruptions and questions throughout. I'm also happy to do it at the end if people prefer, but if anybody does have pressing questions, I'm entirely comfortable with that, though I'm not always good at monitoring hands, so I might ask people to just verbally shout it out. Here's what I will jump to, which is what I think people are probably particularly interested in, which is the text of this, how I'm actually indicating these things, and most importantly, how I'm indicating this felony conviction history. So the approach I use in these emails is based off of the approach used by people I've spoken to, both in the context of collecting data and prior interview studies, but also just informally, which is to say, I in these emails, we state upfront, I want to let you know that I have a, let's say, 2-year-old felony, but no arrest since. Is that a problem, or would you be willing to consider an application from me? So this is an approach that multiple people have shared with me they use in order to avoid spending what can often be hundreds of dollars on application fees and background check fees, credit check fees, all of these things that you have to include when you're submitting an application. And so numerous folks I've talked to have said that after getting burned on several applications and being out hundreds of dollars, this is the approach they turn to try to avoid that. And so that's the approach used in this study. As for everything else, you can see in these different sort of color blocks, these are where I indicate other test conditions. So I say I'm a mom or dad, or I mention a wife or a husband, or I do not for the non-married condition. And then I have a bit about me or a bit about myself where I will indicate age. And then the race and gender is indicated with the name used in the signature, as well as in the email address. So we might have things like brielle.bryan at gmail.com, as well as including Brielle Bryan in the signature of the email to try to indicate race and gender. As for the names used, I spent far too long trying to decide on these, but I will spare you all the hemming and hawing of how exactly I whittled it down, and I will say Mostly that I relied on the work of Michael Gaddis in helping to identify names that are most often identified by people, just people on the internet, as the race or ethnicity they are intended to convey, and names that are in sort of the middle of what you might think of as the class distribution, or based on mother's education level. I can get more into the weeds on that later for anybody who's interested. For anybody who is not, I will move on because it can be, the weeds can get quite high in this area. And I will briefly put up all the names I've used. And I'll note primary thing here is that I've used multiple names for every race and gender combination. I am just looking at white, Black, and Hispanic because these are the groups of names that have the most research behind them in terms of when they are interpreted accurately. And so these are the racial and ethnic categories that I rely on for this. The last thing I will note is that I've run tests to see if anything is being driven by particular names, and I'm not seeing anything that suggests that. So I have confidence there's not anything weird going on with particular names that I chose. As for actually implementing the study, so we've done all of this, creating these emails and these email addresses, writing the text of the emails. Where exactly I did this and sent these out was the 40 largest U.S. cities according to the 2020 U.S. Census. So this is the distribution of them. As you can see, there's sort of a big empty spot in the northwest part of the U.S. where there just are not large cities. But otherwise, there's pretty good distribution across different U.S. regions. So we send these emails to these 40 different cities, and the data that we collect are crucial key things from the ad itself. So that includes the price, as I'd indicated, the unit location, which I'm then able to use to try to drop or pull the proper block group for each unit so that I can pull in neighborhood level characteristics from the American Community Survey and some other data sources. I also have the full text of the ads, though I still haven't gotten to do much with it yet. And then, of course, the text of the emails that we get back when we get responses. And I'll speak a little bit later about what I've been doing with that so far. Okay, so as for the actual data collection process, the way this worked was that Tuesdays through Thursdays were the days of the week that we settled on because presumably people are most likely to be in office these days or less likely to be on vacation or, dealing with school closures for federal holidays, things like that. So we ran this Tuesdays through Thursdays. And key thing I should note is spent a lot of effort trying to do what I'm calling deduplicating these listings. So rather than do what a lot of correspondence or audit studies do of sending 2 or sometimes more inquiries per unit or per employer, often in the case of employment-focused studies, I was very concerned about the potential for the experiment being detected, especially given the size of it and the number of emails I hope to send. So what I settled on was trying my best to only send 1 inquiry per gatekeeper, you might say. So this could be a landlord who's putting the postings up. It could also be somebody who works for a property management company and might be putting multiple postings up, or somebody who works in the leasing office of a large apartment complex and might have multiple units within that complex to post. And so the way that we went about trying to avoid sending multiple emails to the same person, even though we couldn't tell who had actually posted these ads, was first by using a text comparison. So we used I can get into the weeds on this too for anybody who's interested, but anyway, we used a particular text comparison to look for similarities in the text. Anything that was too high between an ad we'd already responded to and a new ad, we pulled out. We did the same for image comparison after some very helpful undergrad RAs realized that sometimes the text is different, but you will see the same pictures in a different order. So then we opted to add an image comparison as well as a way of trying to take out potential duplicates. And then when there were specific phone or email addresses for people that were listed somewhere, we would use those to deduplicate as well. And then finally, we kept a master list of property names that we had responded to. So if there's an apartment building called like the Sherwood Forest at Asher or something like that, we would pull it out and save it in a master list and always check ads. And if it had the same apartment complex name in it, we would say, don't send an email to this ad within our automated system. Another thing we did, because unfortunately Craigslist got more complex between the pilot phase and the actual data collection phase, there are now CAPTCHA challenges that pop up when you ask for a response, an email in order to send an inquiry about a unit. So after doing all of this automated stuff, we would feed the ads that we had come out of the deduping process as ones we wanted to respond to, send them over to MTurk, ask Amazon MTurkers to solve the CAPTCHA challenges for us. And assuming that they got those back to us quickly enough, which luckily they usually did, we would then send an email to that ad on the same day that we had scraped it. So that's the process and how it worked. In doing that, we sent a bit over 26,000 emails across all of these cities between November 2022 and September 2023. After pulling out a few unusual ads that either should have been posted in other parts of Craigslist or were for things like single room occupancy units, things like that don't have sort of the same sort of usual leasing approach as the traditional private rental market. We ended up with a sample of about 25,000 actual units, 25,414 to be exact units that made it into this sort of analytic set that I'll be talking about. Of these roughly 25,000 emails we sent, we received a total of, for 12,000 of them, and 311, we received response emails. For some of them, we received many responses. For all of these, what I'm going to show you going forward is across all the responses we received, taking out ones that we think are duplicates and sort of the general overall answer we got, one overarching answer per email that we sent. All of this was made possible by a team of wonderful RAs, whose names I'll put up later, who went through the trouble of actually manually reading every email response we got and coding it along a number of different dimensions. But a crucial one was, was this an automated response or not? Does this appear to be something that just got kicked back to us by some sort of automated system, or does it seem like a person actually had to hit send on this? And so all of that coding by RAs was completed in May of 2024. And so now I've finally been able to try to comb through all the data and pull in neighborhood level stuff to show you the things I'm going to show you now. So let's talk about general findings. So the first thing I want to note is that often for studies like this, the general sort of question of interest is, what was the response rate in terms of any response received? And so if we think about it that way, what we see is about an 8 percentage point difference in the likelihood of getting a response. So for the emails that say nothing about any sort of criminal justice history or conviction, about 38.2% of them on average get a response. And for those that indicate a felony, we get a response rate around 30%. However, let me click the right way. There we go. However, as I've already hinted, a number of the responses we receive, actually quite a lot, look something like this. They appear to be some sort of automated HTML-based response where maybe they have grabbed the name from the email address or from the signature of our email and they've inserted that, but otherwise there's no information or anything that indicates a person actually read our inquiry email in order to respond to it. So if we pull out these automated looking ones, we get this different response rate for non-automated emails. And here the response rate gap is similar, but it's down to about 7 percentage points. in terms of the difference in getting a response from we think a human between those felony condition emails and the non-felony emails. However, as you may have started to wonder or presumed, the content of these emails is different. So sometimes an email will say, yeah, come on down, you can see the unit, we can talk about the application process. Other times they'll say, I'm sorry, this unit's already been rented or is no longer available or something of that nature. And so, because of these wonderful RAs, I know what the email actually said. And so, if we instead think of this in terms of what I'm calling a positive response rate, in the broadest possible way, we get up to about a 10 percentage point difference in response rates. And so, part of this is, as you may have guessed, the likelihood of getting what I call a negative response. So, something indicating that the unit is no longer available. Or, to be more blunt, that individuals with felony convictions are not going to be considered. So this is part of what's going on here, but it's not all of it. I will note in here, I realize it's not labeled, so I'll just tell you what this yellow box is. These are the emails that actually affirmatively say having a conviction is not necessarily a problem. Something like, thanks for letting us know. We might be able to work with you. It doesn't necessarily rule you out. So part of what's going on with what I'm calling these positive responses are these true affirmative sort of yes responses that it's not going to totally tank your application. We might be willing to work with you. But most of them just aren't clear. They just don't clearly say no, and they don't clearly say yes. They instead sort of indicate like, well, I don't know, we use a third party background check, and it sort of depends what comes up on that, or things of that nature. So most of this is pretty nebulous. What I'm choosing to focus on in the analyses I'll show you going forward is this broadly construed positive response. So rather than focusing only on the ones that say, yes, it's okay, because that's a small sample, I'm focusing on this broader set where there is sort of a hope that it might still be reasonable to apply, with the thought being that a lot goes on in an application process. And what a lot of folks who have felony convictions on their record do is essentially plead their case and try to win over whoever has the decision-making power. And so these are the emails that to me appear to be the ones where there's at least a possibility that they could proceed with an application. And so this is what I'll be focusing on moving forward. So everything that I've showed you thus far is just for that overall any type of or any age of felony mentioned. But if I split it out by age of felony, you see more or less what you would probably expect. So the 10 percentage point gap that I had noted for these positive response rates, that really comes from these people in the middle range here who have about 5 to 8-year-old felony convictions. If it is a more recent conviction, if somebody says I got a conviction 2 years ago, but I haven't had any arrests since, we see a larger gap, about a 12.5 percentage point difference in the response rate. And for people who say it's been 12 years since my conviction, the gap does not go away, unfortunately, but it is smaller. It's about 6 percentage points. So there is a clear sort of diminishing of the effect over time. Whether or not it's as fast as we might have hoped or presumed is up to debate. I presume that this is what I'm finding so far. So as for all of these other potential moderating effects for all of the other test conditions I had mentioned before, the first thing I will note is that I'm only seeing very modest differences in overall response rates by race, ethnicity, and by gender, which I will note is in keeping with recent housing audit study work that suggests that the way that discrimination is happening in the housing market, it appears to be less so on this just sort of do you get a response rate front and more in terms of steering these days. So these small gaps, I think, are sort of in keeping with just what's happening right now. I do find on average that women have a bit of an advantage, but all of these are pretty small. I'm also finding that if I look for moderating effects of race or gender on that felony conviction gap. There's a little bit going on, but really not much. So if anything, the size of the black-white gap in response rates is actually slightly smaller for the felony condition emails relative to the non-felony emails. And then across the board, there's slight little differences, but none of them actually reach statistical significance. So there's more to be done here. And in fact, I do want to note that I need to spend more time playing with the data and thinking about intersectionality, not just of race and gender, but also of parent status and marital status and things like this as well. And I'm still very much in the data on these questions, but I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. What I am seeing here, and I realize these aren't all labeled the best, but on the right-hand side here, what you're seeing are the felony condition emails in the blue and the red. And on the left-hand side, we have the non-felony emails. So if you're looking closely, you'll see the scales are slightly different. The key thing I want to note here is that there is a white female advantage in general, regardless of which group you're in, but it appears to be even slightly larger amongst people with a felony condition. So there are things like this happening in the data. But there's not one like super clear, big race only or gender only story. It seems to be more nuanced. Where I am finding some clearer stories is less on the individual characteristics and more on unit and place-based characteristics. So thus far, the only unit level characteristic I've looked at is just the rent, the asking rent for an apartment or a house that's being posted. But I do, as I'd mentioned before, have information that comes from the text of the ad itself and other fields on Craigslist, including things like apartment size, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, etc. So at some point, I plan to explore those as well. Thus far, I've only looked at rent. And then I have been trying to think about what's happening at the neighborhood level at this point, just by using census block groups and looking at various sort of economic, demographic, and housing characteristics. We'll note these aren't necessarily the right ways to categorize all of these. I'm also looking at violent crime rate, which it doesn't really fit into any of these. So I want to acknowledge that it's not truly a demographic characteristic, but that's where I put it for this particular slide. And what I'm seeing in doing this is, first off, that rent matters. The relationship changes based on the rent, even standardized at the city level of how expensive an apartment is. And I'm also seeing a number of things that suggest that broadly construed neighborhood advantage matters too. So the first thing I will show you is the moderating effect of unit rent, so the actual unit being advertised. And what I'm finding is that there is a gap at all parts of the market if we're thinking about how expensive a unit is that's being advertised, but that gap gets larger the more expensive the unit is. For everybody, whether or not you have a felony conviction, you could expect to be more likely to get a response if you are inquiring about a more expensive apartment or house, but that increase is sharper for people who don't indicate a felony conviction. If, however, we think about what's happening in terms of neighborhood level median rent, so thinking sort of about like how maybe desirable is this neighborhood within this market, how much are asking rents in the neighborhood, what we see is that at that neighborhood level, there is no change in terms of the median rent for the neighborhood and the response rate for non-felony condition emails. They can expect to get the same overall response rate, holding unit rent constant, I should note. So I'm controlling for that in these models. I should also note, should have noted before, I've got city level random effects in here and a number of other controls. But what I am seeing is that for those felony condition emails, the more expensive the median rent in a neighborhood, the less likely someone is to get a response. So not only does the unit rent itself seem to matter, but the sort of asking rents in a neighborhood itself also seem to be influencing how this relationship is working. And I see a similar thing with home values. So another way of trying to think about sort of how advantaged or privileged is a neighborhood, what do the individuals there look like? Here we see that For people without a felony condition, if you're sending an inquiry about a unit and you're sending it to a unit in a more expensive neighborhood in terms of the average home values there, you're more likely to receive a response. But the relationship is more or less flat for people with a felony conviction. And as a result, what that means is the response rate gap, ends up being much larger in more expensive neighborhoods. This story is also coming up in poverty measures. So this is just the percent of households in the block group that are below the poverty threshold. What we can see here is that if you are looking at highly impoverished neighborhoods, these are a rarity, but there are a handful of block groups in this data set where the number of households below the poverty threshold is actually right at 100%. If we're looking at those types of neighborhoods, there is no response rate gap. Doesn't appear to exist, or at least, we can't say with any confidence given the size of the confidence intervals. But in neighborhoods where no one is below the poverty threshold, this is where we're really seeing this big response rate gap come in. So again, this is not so dissimilar from what I'm showing you with average home values and rent. It's all part and parcel of this idea of sort of neighborhood level economic disadvantage. But it's also coming through in this other way of thinking about advantage in terms of what is the neighborhood level violent crime rate. So I want to flag for this. Thus far, I only have the violent crime rate pulled for 17 of my cities. So I'm going to keep working on this. I have some RAs who are pulling more recent crime data and different types of crime as well. So this is an area where I really need to expand the analysis. But here are some preliminary findings from what I have so far. And here it's a similar story. And I think it's probably all tangled up together in terms of what I was seeing in terms of median rent and average home value within a neighborhood. Is probably very much related to what's going on here as well, which is that if you're looking at neighborhoods with the highest levels of violent crime, the response rate between people with and without felony convictions is indistinguishable. But if you're looking at neighborhoods with no violent crime reported in 2017, this is where the response rate gap is largest, where you're really seeing a big difference in whether or not somebody who is upfront and acknowledges a felony conviction is going to get any indication that they could potentially move forward with an application for a unit. Okay, so now I realize I've been rambling on for quite some time, so I'm gonna highlight this next thing that I'm very excited about but haven't had a chance to really dig into yet and explore and explain in particular. But the thing that I'm really, really interested in trying to figure out is why the response rate gaps are so different across cities. So I don't know how well you'll be able to see this on your screens, but there are some cities in this set, like Memphis, Virginia Beach is another one, where there is essentially no gap at all. Columbus comes close. There's a slight gap, but it's very small. There are some cities in my 40 cities where there is no clearly a distinguishable gap in response rates between those emails where I indicated a felony and the emails where I didn't. But then there are other cities like New York City in particular, where there is a huge response rate gap between those non-felony emails and the felony condition emails. And so this is what's sort of on docket for me next. I'm trying to figure out what are the things I want to pull in particular thinking about sort of the hotness of a market and vacancy rates, things like that. And so I'm trying to figure out metrics for that. If people have ideas, I'm very open to them. But this is on the horizon, and I look forward to any questions or suggestions in this area. Beyond this, as I noted, I have the actual text of the emails coming back, and so I've been trying to think about potential content analysis there in terms of what's actually in the emails themselves. And as I already sort of noted, I'm going to think about things like vacancy rate, but also local conviction rate, the policy context. I'm also trying to think about there's some way of measuring which cities are more sort of landlord friendly or more renter friendly. And then I need to explore nonlinearities in the data and all sorts of things. But I want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the people and funders without whom this project would have been impossible. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to various seed grants and a couple of grants from the Russell Sage Foundation, and then an army of undergraduate RAs who made this possible, and some truly remarkable postdocs as well. Okay, so I will wrap up there, and I'm eager to hear any suggestions, ideas, and questions that you all have. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you. Yay, team. Maybe just in terms of visuals, maybe you could just kind of remove that. There, perfect. Thank you.
Is that okay? Good.
So, as usual, I have lots of questions, but I'm not going to start. So, questions, comments, observations, thoughts, please just put your hand up. Yeah, please, Leanne.
Hi. I first want to say this is super interesting. I've never heard of an audit study before, so I just think this is a super cool way to collect data. I didn't even realize this was a thing. So I just want to say that was awesome and just awesome talk overall. I have a couple questions. So first, I was just wondering for marital status, I didn't see in the email. I was wondering if you used like terminology that was I guess ambiguous in terms of someone's like sexual orientation. So we're using like the term partner, or you using like wife or husband. And if you were using those like husband, wife, like gendered terms, I was also wondering if you included like non-heteronormative like couple types, and if you saw any differences or any like discrimination that might be happening based on someone's sexual orientation.
Thank you. This is such a great question. This is one that I wrestled with and I wanted to do, but then finally decided I've got too many test conditions. And so it was my hope to, I guess it still is, to collect another round of data where I vary this. But for what I've shown you, for the sake of making sure I could get enough statistical power for all the other things I'd already told Grant, the funders that I was going to test, I decided to just stick to heteronormative indications of marital status. So rather than partner, I said husband or wife, and rather than varying that randomly or purposefully across gender, I decided to cut down on test conditions and just do heteronormative pairings. So it means that unfortunately I cannot speak to those questions, but I think they're really good questions, and that I would like to think I will tackle them myself someday. I will also fully acknowledge there's a good chance I don't, and so I will encourage anybody who's interested in getting into audit studies to consider, sending me an email. We can set up a time to chat, because I think these are very interesting questions too, worth exploring.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question, I was just wondering if those differences with like the gaps in the responses versus no responses in the different cities, do you have the data on whether those cities have the fair chance housing ordinances? I think you mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah, I do. I also forgot to mention how many cities actually have those housing ordinances, and it's not many. So I believe it's 3. Well, so New York now has it, but didn't have it at the time of data collection. And then the others that are some cities in my, so I use Craigslist markets, which means that I use the San Francisco Craigslist page. But within that, there are lots of units from across San Francisco Bay being posted. So it's not just units in San Francisco proper. And so I have this information, but have not yet pulled it in for the places that are affected. So the first cities that passed these were small city, Oakland, Berkeley, were the first couple of amongst the first cities that passed these. So I will be able for those units to pull that information in. Seattle likewise has one, and Portland more recently added one. So I will add it for those. But In just glancing at the response rates, it doesn't look like it's not those cities that are the ones with no gap, which is the interesting thing. The places, San Antonio and El Paso also have smaller response rate gaps. Nothing on the books in those places. Same for Memphis and Virginia Beach. So it's something that I have and will pull in, but it's very few of the cities or markets in this sample that actually have these things on the books. But yeah, it's a great question.
All right, thanks so much.
Alicia, please. Oh, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Dr. Bryan, thank you so much for your talk. It was really wonderful. I do have a question that might be a more Canadian question, so it might not be relevant in the US context. But I am wondering if there was a difference or if you captured at all a difference in the response rates with proximity, towns that are in closer or lesser proximity to prisons. In Canada, we have what's known as like quote unquote prison towns, where the towns are residential areas are very close to prisons versus areas where they're more in rural places. So I'm wondering if there was a difference at all, or if it's even relevant to look at proximity to prisons and response rates.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I have not looked at that. I can tell you the US is similar in that prisons, by and large, are more often in rural areas, and so it sort of end up, not always, but sometimes having these sort of prison towns. But those rural areas can sometimes still be within sort of a larger metro area, and so might actually end up in the data that I have. Lindsay is actually probably maybe a better person to talk to about this than me, and might have some good intuitions on this. But it's definitely something that I can look into, proximity to a prison or a jail. It will take some doing, but it's entirely possible. So thank you for that suggestion. All I can say right now is, unfortunately, I haven't looked at it, but I think it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, fair. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in?
Oh, yes, please.
Two. One's really a question, one's really just a rumination. So would there be any value in something as crude as red versus blue? States, cities, something like that? So that's the real question. The rumination is, I've actually seen, I don't pay close attention, but I've seen more and more of these types of audit studies where people are sent things online and you're measuring kind of responses, etc. And these have gotten some public attention in the media, etc. So the left field question is, at what point do people who are advertising jobs, etc., start to assume that a certain percentages of what they're getting are fake? And what if that's a realistic assumption, what implications might that have for research or for housing or for whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I was actually chatting about recently with somebody else who works in the housing audit area. The fact that it's becoming easier and easier to run these, and that increases both the risk of detection, but also the costs to real people, to actual HR managers, to actual landlords who are trying to find somebody for their unit, if they're just getting more and more false inquiries, basically. And that's as far as I can give an answer to you on that, unfortunately. Is that, yeah, you're right. I think it's something to keep in mind. To my knowledge, it's still not so widespread that I think that this is on the radar of most HR managers or property management companies. But recently I went to a presentation about somebody who's working with the Department of Justice on trying to use this sort of methodology to help them build cases against large scale, like corporate landlords or property management companies that have been accused of discriminating. And so to the extent that this becomes a tool for enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, I think that becomes an increasing risk that that this first stage of the process, which is really all we can gauge easily, gets to a point where, there's always an assumption that somebody is either including you in some sort of research study or potentially auditing you for the sake of law enforcement and anti-discrimination enforcement. And so then there's also the question of not just like, will they notice, but will these studies be valid? Will they give us real signals? Or are we just going to, maybe erase allegedly discrimination at the first stage of the process, but then it increases more so at the second stage or third stage, where it's much harder to actually gauge without, getting real people who are willing to have their credit check run and their background check run to go along with the study. And that's a whole other can of worms. I'm going to say that I think we're not there yet. So I think that right now, at this point in time, we can still probably learn a decent bit from these studies, but I think we're probably heading in that direction. And so, somewhere on the horizon, we're probably going to get to a point where we're just not going to be able to learn as much that we can really trust from this methodology. But for now, since I did just include it and encourage grad students to maybe try it, I think we have a little bit of a window left. But it's a very valid concern. The other thing, as for red versus blue states and cities, I think this could be part of it. But I also want to note New York, very blue state, very blue city, and this is where the gap is largest. And in fact, Memphis. Fairly blue city, very red state, and there's no gap at all. So, it's something I will explore, but I don't know if it's as simple as that. But it's certainly something that I can and will put into the models as I try to figure out how to explain away this variation. Great question. Wish I had a better answer.
The thing I forgot to say, this is an astounding study. I mean, you're to be kind of congratulated. This is a massive project.
Thank you. I'm not sure I would actually encourage any other assistant professors to do this. At this point in my career, I feel like maybe this was a mistake, but hopefully we'll get tenure and we'll see. But thank you very much. I appreciate that. I see a hand from
Emily. You had your hand up, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm trying to figure out my camera here. There we go. Yeah, I kind of have a similar question to Alicia and Leanne, but I was wondering, and if I missed this, I apologize, but did you see anything or look at anything to do with like employment status and if that impacted things as well? And then my other question too is just what was the ethics process like for this? Like, because I guess if you're like deceiving, let's say, landlords, is that something that you had to go through? Did you have to apply for that? That's just another question that I had.
Yeah, that's both great questions. As for employment status, this is one where I decided not to include it. First in the pilot study, I included language indicating that I have a job and I have references, but I also, even though saying that, I would get emails back saying, "Are you employed? Like how much do you make per week?" Asking interesting sort of questions, even in the pilot stage when I said it explicitly. So I decided to actually leave it out so that I could see what kind of questions I got back in the response emails. And so that's something that my RAs have coded for, but I haven't had a chance to run any analyses on it yet, is when questions are asked about employment directly, and so that I can see are they asked differentially across different types of people. And I don't have an answer on that yet. But I can tell you that very frequently some mention of employment comes back in the email. They will either say, I need to know your work history, or they might say, as long as you're steadily employed, it's not a problem. So employment is certainly something that seems to interact with this. I chose not to vary it within the emails, but I think there's likely to be something going on when I dig into that data, but I don't know for sure yet. As for the other question, can you remind me?
Yeah, just like the ethical process or
yes.
ethics, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So this is one where I went through my university's IRB because it is technically deception. I was I guess lucky in that for my IRB, they decided that the risk was quite low, and so they were comfortable with this, and didn't make me. The big thing was they didn't make me reveal the experiment after the fact, which some folks elsewhere have to do, and which I was worried about in case my attempts to not email the same person multiple times failed. I really was concerned that if I emailed somebody and then my IRB required me to email them back and say, hey, this was just a study, sorry, please ignore it, and then I accidentally emailed that same person again, well, then I'm definitely not going to get a response. And so my IRB did not require me to do that, but I think that varies a lot institution to institution. I've had friends elsewhere who've done sort of similar studies where their IRB has had them jump through a lot more hoops, and often had them sort of reveal the study after the fact to people that they had emailed. So this is sort of like a your mileage may vary response.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time and that people had said that they had to sort of disappear for various things. So maybe we'll just end it there, and I will just sort of take the initiative to sort of say, I presume that you'd be open to other questions on email. But please join me virtually thanking Brielle. That was a really fantastic, the methodological rigor is astounding. So well done.
Thank you so much. And please do send me emails. I would love to hear suggestions, questions, ideas at this stage. This is the right stage. So my email address is just my name, brielle.bryan@rice.edu. So please do send stuff my way. Thank you so much for everybody's time and attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And for folks in the CCR,